this is a work primarily by a PhD student of mine, but unfortunately could not travel with us here to Seoul. So I will try to present it for her, and I have also been part of writing, so I should be able to do that. But it concerns a PhD that deals with the topic of diversity in urbanity, which would be a variable or an important contribution to urbanity, I would guess, not least by Jane Jacobs' discussion. And of course the PhD is having a larger attempt of trying to address the concept of diversity and also how it possibly could be measured. This paper, though, is a little bit short version of that, focusing on certain dimensions of that, primarily an empirical study of local markets around Stockholm, neighborhood centers and their markets, and try to understand the spatial conditions that might influence the size of these markets. And then also taking the chance to do that in the framework of the 4 criteria proposed by Jane Jacobs for creating the diversity in cities. So there's kind of boxes in boxes in boxes here, but I'll try to introduce it. It's quite obvious, just as the previous speaker spoke of, among other things, of course, that diversity is an increasing demand, but it's at the same time an elusive concept. I think the diversity has become now almost, when you do this ranking around the world, what cities are most attractive and all these things, and also in general policy about cities, it has become an increasingly important concept. Everything is supposed to be diverse, and the cities that are the most diverse are the most attractive, and they're the most creative, and they're the most everything. And diversity is becoming a really, really important measure. At the same time, and it has many expressions like mixed use, functional diversity, and so at the same time, as it's talked about a lot, it's very imprecise. It's unclear what we are talking about in different ways. And some questions you could ask is, for example, diversity of what? What is it the diversity of? Diversity of people from different groups in society? Is it the actual diversity in architecture? Is it diversity in retail? Is it diversity in amusements? Is it diversity? There are so many things. And then also to ask, if we are looking at it, is it diversity, on what scale are we talking about diversity? We could say that diversity in the modernist cities is very high, because on a very large scale, of course, they're very diverse, because there are lots of different activities and different uses and functions in such a city, but often maybe we talk about diversity on a much smaller scale, so that you can encounter different things in the same space and so forth. And finally, how do we measure it? Because it can be useful to measure, and of course we are at a conference where this is kind of been a central theme, to try to measure different dimensions of architecture and urbanism, in the aim to, of course, understand it better, so that we can talk it more distinct about it, understand this certain way, of course, but also maybe to actually tie certain spatial variables to the qualitative variables that we maybe finally are aiming for. So, but we'll be a little bit more aware of how we're actually going to go about when designing the qualities that we aim for. So in this study, the more general aim is to investigate how spatial form, defined as spatial configuration as structured and shaped by built form, can influence local markets, both when it comes to their size, or as we have chosen to refer to it in the text, intensity, the intensity of the local market. but also, and maybe more originally, when it comes to their what we call constitution or diversity, the constitution of the diversity, not only the intensity. And actually, in this paper, we only talk about diversity and how we measure that, and not so much the size of the market, of the diversity. In the PhD, also deals with the intensity of the market. And then there are, of course, certain methodological challenges in this, and that is how to measure economic diversity in this specific context. And we will not talk so much about that in this paper, but more about how to define relevant spatial criteria that can be measured. You're starting to understand that cost. The empirical material for this is actually all of the inner city of Stockholm. We have a large amount of data when it comes to retail. We have a very rich database of detailed data on the retail distribution in large parts of Stockholm. So what we're looking for is first one set that is all of the inner city of Stockholm and all of the southern suburbs, but not the northern suburbs. That's one set that we look at all of these at the same time. And then we do another set where we concentrate on 15 conversion centers in the semi-central and suburban locations around Stockholm. So it's kind of two empirical studies. And of course, we also chose to frame this within the ideas of Jane Jacobs. It could have been done totally without that, actually, but as an extra thing, we chose to integrate her ideas, especially in this paper. It's not as prominent in the PhD. And there's obvious reasons for that. Her main theme, as we have heard very well presented already, is diversity. I mean, not to this group, but otherwise it can be worth to mention that. Otherwise, as you say, for example, a more simplified discussion about new urbanism, or she becomes some kind of most general coffee shop urbanism promoter or something. But there is a very strong theme on diversity, and not least the economical background to that, and diversity as a prominent driver in economic development and so forth, which she develops much more in her later books, of course. So that's the theme there is very distinct throughout almost everything she has written. And she actually suggests in her book that retail would be a very good indicator of diversity. So that fits very well too. And then, of course, she famously proposes urban criteria for diversity. What is it that could constitute diversity in cities? And she talks about short blocks, mix of primary uses, aged buildings, and concentration of people. But at the same time, these concepts are, once again, rather vague, and they also, that may also why they are misused so much, as we all know, in different circumstances, where more or less anything could be mixed use, or anything could be, so what is short blocks and things like that. It's very vague. Oh yes, by each buildings and so forth. And among the very few diagrams that Jane Jacobs uses in her book, I think it's easy to see, once again, this is another one of these threads of seeing the different classic urban design texts, or the texts that have been very important for contemporary urban design, and to try to see the links. I like very much the link with Kevin Lynch and Ed Hillier, for example. And actually you could see almost that what Jane Jacobs was asking for was space syntax. And I heard Bill at the conference 1 month ago, and he said, well, space syntax, it's only putting numbers on Jane Jacobs. So, I mean, there's obvious connections here. But this, however, is much more analytical in its aim. And of course, Jane Jacobs is distinctly normative, telling us what a good city is. Even though it's hidden behind here, it's of course promoted much more as an analytical approach. So what we try to do is actually to try to redefine the way she defines the criteria in some kind of operative terms, using space syntax and also some other types of analytical tools that we have developed in extension of. space index analysis. So, when it comes to short blocks, which you always put that in a very different way, we have heard very well already. But then we try to put in operative terms by measure of the relative distance, so both integration and choice, and of course within a set of different radii from the chosen market course that will be our starting point in our analysis. And of course that's rather easy to see how short blocks, what it does is that it changes the configuration and also changes the relative difference between the distance to different locations, so it's a rather obvious translation. On the other hand, our initial problem of what scale are we working with could also be solved then by doing that kind of analysis on different radii and saying that the large radius is for larger scale and the small radius is for smaller scale. Rather simple. I'm saying rather simple things here, but I'm just stressing this because this has been one of the discussions that is important and developed in the papers. And then concentration of people. Once again, of course, there are lots of arguments for that. And that we have put in operative terms by doing what we call attraction accessibility. Using the Play syntax tool, which is a development we have done where we actually, it's a basic network tool. We can do all kinds of network analysis. That is, that we can calculate the distance to all kind of attractions that we have data on. So it's a plug-in to a GIS MapInfo, where you can, anything that you have data, location data on, you can calculate the accessibility to that. There's something I was going to say. Okay. So, for example, when it comes to concentration of people, we can calculate the accessibility to, yes, we can, what's different from many other GIS tools is that we can use the axial line as a distance measure. So it's, in that way, bringing in space syntax measures and concepts into a regular network analysis. And that way, so we can use different distances to calculate accessibility to both working population and residential population. And once again, within the area, so that we can interpret that as a way of analyzing different scales. The third one is mix of primary functions. And once again, being things like residential and commercial and working offices and things like large primary functional groups. And once again, we can use the same tool to calculate accessibility to residents and to workplaces, for example, but now measuring the mix of these, the degree of having both, so to speak, not only the accessibility to workplaces or to residents, but to what degree do we access a mix of these two? And that is what we see as the operative translation of Jacob's idea of mix of primary functions. Rather simple. The last one is maybe the one that is most, I think, okay, it is old building, should say old buildings. That maybe is the most difficult to immediately translate to anything, but how do you measure a thing like that, the presence of old buildings? And that is something, and maybe it should say a little bit more about how we have operationalization, put that in operative terms. And that goes back to some earlier ideas that I've been working with about exactly trying to understand and measure and analyze diversities. It is some earlier things. Where I talk about something called spatial capacity. And rather than looking actually at the immediate buildings, I argue that one could look at land division, or the plot structures, or the structure of parcels. Just because it's so difficult to find data on buildings, you could go more directly to look at the parcels and the land division of urban areas. And of course, in areas, it could be argued that areas where you have accessibility to a large amount of different parcels, you are likely to also have accessibility to different agents in the city, that different owners and disposers of these different parcels. They are likely to have different agendas for their plots, and in the next step they might, the way they take care of the buildings and so forth, and their plots are differ, and in the end you could argue that there is likely to be an area where you could have a greater diversity, also in uses or in people living there, and so forth. For example, mixing different income groups. There are forces going against this, of course, but in principle that you have different parcels, different owners, different strategies, and so forth. Some of them will exactly follow Jane Jacobs' argument. Some of them will maybe not maintain their buildings so much. They will not make them into luxury housing and so forth. And some will make them into luxury housing. And suddenly you have a diversity of buildings, and you have the diversity in apartment sizes and diversity, and that could also lead to a greater general diversity in the urban area. And actually, we have done further studies of that and found quite promising and very interesting correlations that kind of says that it seems very, very likely. It's a very good way of capturing these phenomena. So that's the third way, fourth criteria, and that will then be an accessibility to plots or parcels as a way of measuring the presence of old buildings. So formalizing this, short blocks concentrated about centrality and betweenness accessibility, tools, configurative network analysis, regular space index analysis, concentration of people, similar to that, but actually using our tool where you can add geographic data. Same thing for age buildings, accessible plots. You can make an analysis of how many plots do you reach within a certain radius, and mix of primary using the same tool again. So we have now a set where we can do a test. We have translated our concepts. We can have a tool to analyze it. Let's see how far we get. Which one will work best? Of course, you can argue whether this is a good translation of Jane Jacobs, but it's a test. The case study is 15 areas around the center of Stockholm. And maybe I should say, now I'm particularly talking about the 15 centers. There were 2 studies, one of the 15 centers, and one of all of the south suburbs, and also all of the inner city. Have a large sample and then 15 local samples in 2 parallel studies. When it came to the 15 centers, we thought that we should be a bit careful about how we would define the actual market center, rather than just saying, because these are typically neighborhood units. Yes, I should say that. These are typical neighborhood units in their typically Swedish translation, which is a housing area, a residential area, supported by public transit, public underground, with a commercial center in the middle, some schools and so forth. Let's say 8,000 inhabitants, it varies, 8,000, 10,000, or something like that. So it's a very planned structure. So of course there is somewhere that it's planned and said that this is the center. But we thought that we would check that and say that let's instead define the market core by analyzing the accessibility to retail within the radius. And then we go back and say, so the center is actually located here, rather maybe it's planned to be here, it has been moved over here or something. So all of these, so it's a particular analysis in itself to define the market cores. And then we come to measuring diversity, which is a very, very tricky thing in itself, and probably something we need to develop much more here. But there are certain sets of typical ways of calculating that. A very common measure is the entropy measure, which is a classic measure developed by Claude Shannon. So it's also called the Shannon index sometimes. But there is also other variants of this. For example, the Simpson index, and there's a neighborhood diversity index, and so forth. There's a set of measures here that are, and they're much more difficult to understand than a regular, for example, a density measure or something, which really is easy to grasp. But these diversity measures are much more difficult because they are relative. Anyway, maybe I'm talking too long, but we chose to divide all retail into 6 main groups, and then calculate the degree of the presence of all these in the different centers as a measure of diversity, using the Shannon index to get the numbers. And first of all, which also shows what you can do with the play syntax tool. This is a rather unusual calculation, is it? It's measuring diversity of retail activity. What is more precisely is the accessible retail diversity. That is having the measurement of diversity and measuring the accessibility to that within 150 meters walking distance. Very, very, very close in this particular case. Measured as entropy, whereas with this channel index. So that kind of picks out centers, not depending on the size of them, which you can see, for example, when Bill shows centers and so forth, that you have a lot of shops. But this shows the degree of diversity of these shops. And that is also what we call the constitution of the market area, not the size, not the amount of retail, but the degree of diversity. And it's quite interesting the different, how you do capture the different groups, but also the variation in diversity. I can also use this to show you the importance of what scale you're doing. This is a very local scale. In certain areas that you would expect with high diversity, for example, are not diverse at all. The very, very center of Stockholm, which has a lot of shops, lots of retail. But you remember the categories I had, the diversity between these. Large and small food shops, clothing, culture and leisure shops, IT equipment, households. That kind of diversity is not found in the central city on that local scale. Because there you find only, almost, to simplify, only clothing shops. But the diversity, if you instead will look at the diversity within this, of course, the city center would be the most diverse. You don't find that diversity in clothing shops over here. You see, so the whole, what scale you're looking at is very important. Then just to show some of the analysis we've done, so, I will not show all of them. The centrality and betweenness of market force, which would then represent short blocks. This is showing, just putting the gray dots here are simply the shops, the amount of shops, the actual shops put in geographically, and overlaying that with the axis integration, in this case, 7 action steps. And then we can see that how this varies. In certain places we do get correlations between integration and where the shops are. In other cases we clearly see that they do not overlap at all, and so forth. So in the end we will, of course, test this with the correlation, but just to show it more graphically here. And this is betweenness, 5 kilometers, and once again we can see that in certain cases we do have streets along between streets that are high betweenness degrees, but we also find places where this is not the case, like here the betweenness line is here and the street centers are here. Am I running out of time? Please tell me, because I don't want to. And then concentration of people. Then we can do another kind of test using the place and syntax tool again. We put all the residents and all working people, and then we analyze the accessibility to those. In this case, within 500 meters walking distance, and we see how they vary. So that's distinctly is a market, the market demand in different places, you could say, basic circumstance and how that varies. Once again, you can see there's not many residents in the central part of Stockholm, and then it varies all over. So that's another one, other measurement. Let's see. And this is what I was about to take away with. So let's now I'm coming to the end here. Just looking at some of the correlations we've done of these, measuring a lot, and finding not distinctly high, but I think in rather normal terms, we often expect very high correlations in space index studies, but there are still very, very distinct results here of interesting and significant correlations. We could choose then one of the which has to do with what we call short blocks or the distance. And one variable, one measure that turns out very good is integration at the radius 7, which correlates pretty well all over. But we have also sorted this so you can see that in the inner city the correlation is much higher than in the southern part of the city, and these varies a little bit. I can go through all of that. We can say that accessibility to total population, that is concentration of people, correlates very well, almost all over. We can also say that the accessibility to other economic activities was an additional measure we added, is also very strong. Interesting, the accessibility to plots or the aged building concept correlates surprisingly well in the inner city, very well actually, while in the outer city not at all. So that's something to follow up. And similarly, when it comes to the 15 market course, the other study, we get kind of similar. We get that the correlates better with betweenness, less well with integration. Accessible total population, very high again. Accessible plots, not good. It's all in the outer city again. There's something there that is different while it correlates well in the inner city. Accessibility of other economic actors, some kind of a clustering effect is also, of course, very strong. This is kind of an correlation. So, finally, going back to findings and conclusions. For the inner and outer city analysis, most important variable is accessible population and accessibility to other actors, as I already said. In the inner city, also integration 7, the radius 7 is important, and also accessibility to plots. Most important for the 50 market course are accessible population again and accessibility to other actors. This comes again all the time. But also betweenness is more important in the market course than the integration, which one could try to interpret. Plots in this case is insignificant. It's only in the inner city that is important. So if we come back to the Indigenous criteria, this was what I was writing when I said all criteria are relevant somewhere, but to varying degree, depending on the context, whether it's an inner city, outer city, and so forth. Most important is concentration to people. It's everywhere. If you have a lot of people, you have not probably a larger market, you have also a more diverse market. This also kind of sounds reasonable. Short blocks, that is the general accessibility or distance to things, is also important generally in most cases, but varying in measurement. It seems like betweenness is more strong in the market course and integration in the inner and outer city analysis. All buildings is of great importance in the inner city, and then I have to stop. But not so important in the outer city. So, as you see, it's kind of also testing the possibility of doing such a thing. And so we push things towards the kind of interpretation of these results. And of course one can have arguments in each step here, but it's trying to actually capture the J. Jacobs criteria for urbanity with in operatives, translating it to some kind of operative measures, testing that and seeing which one would be more or less important. that we can actually show. And then we, of course, can have discussions on each step of translation, on methodological choices here, and not least that we're now looking at the city of Stockholm, which is kind of a special sort of. But still, it's kind of saying something. And generally speaking, one could say that King Jacobs was right. Thank you. Yeah?
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I have to look closer at this. I have one question about